Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends of the ICD. In my free time, I'm a photographer, and there's a photography rule that if I don't see you, you don't see me. So I better stand up to give everyone a chance to not only hear what I'm saying, but also to communicate more directly, especially with the ladies and gentlemen in the other part of the room. It's been a while since I got a chance to speak in an event of the ICD, and I must say I miss it because it has always been a different type of challenge than the ones I'm used to. Like if you get a request from the media, then you explain the world in 3 minutes. If you get a request from the ICD, you get one in 30 minutes. This time I want to make it a bit shorter because I think what I do in my ivory tower, if I get a supersized request like explain the world in 30 minutes and global threats on democracy and on peace in 30 minutes, then it's a task no one can do. But it's a wonderful opportunity to follow this approach of until I don't listen to myself talking, I don't know what I think. And following this approach, I was already starting to think what I would respond if the question would have been to me. And so I think I will skip the academic part in reflecting on what makes a global threat, and what do we mean by democracy if we look at it from within the Croatian embassy inside of the European Union, which is something I also very much like about events of the ICD, that we are not as much navel glazing as I used to, because as a professor of European studies, we tend to meet with the usual suspects and think about something, and then we suddenly are forced to wake up, as we did on the 24th of February, and woke up in a world that was not the world we thought will become the world of the future, a bit like the end of history. If we are committed to the rule of law and to Western-type democratic standards, then sooner or later the rest of the world wants to become like us, because this is the best of all systems, and then someone uses force and crosses borders and starts a war on a continent that even got the Nobel Prize for stopping to kill each other, which doesn't necessarily mean that this is a model for the rest of the world. So there's a lot going on right now when we look at the rest of the world, and with the requests that I get from non-European countries, it's both a lesson in modesty, that I see that what we think within our bubble inside of the European Union is not necessarily the perspective of countries located in other part of the world, with different relations with Russia and a different perspective on NATO. So the celebration of this is the best news we can possibly get, that Finland and Sweden is joining NATO, is certainly something we in the European Union will subscribe to, but whether the rest of the world is sort of following the Russian narrative more or less in terms of this makes the world a safer or a better place, is something we can discuss, given that this is not the usual suspects, but quite a substantive and more diverse audience to look at this from different angles. So what I thought I'd do, instead of reflecting on the key terms and a more like academic introduction before I come to the more interesting part, I skip the first and jump right into the more interesting one. If we look at threats in action, like what is actually happening and not something what one can list as challenges of a global dimension in the 21st century, then the first thing that comes to all of our minds, leaving aside the ones who haven't fully understood this yet, then it's climate change. And climate change comes with so many repercussions and unintended consequences that I don't need to go into detail because we all know what I'm talking about. Other forms of global threats that are not in the similar way hitting the globe and therefore threatening what the living conditions of mankind are, because the planet as such doesn't care whether there are humans on this planet or not. So the threats are specifically about the human species and the living conditions for us. So this other type of global threats refer to something that appears in variation in our different cultural contexts, which makes it a very interesting topic to discuss in the framework of an Institute for Cultural Diplomacy event. But it is not something like an exogenous shock that affects all of us, but it is something like a virus, to use a pandemic metaphor, that spreads around the world, and that is polarization of societies and populism as an instrument for those who have short-term political interests and use it accordingly to their different political environment. And then we have a number of economic crises, and one was mentioned by the Mr. Chairman, who brought up the question of, is it a wise idea to start massive economic sanctions if sanctions work both ways? But that's the nature of sanctions. Sanctions do work both ways, and the general idea, if you read Clausewitz or other theories of war, is how hard can you hit and how much can you handle if the counter-reaction is a consequence of your action. And this is something I assume everyone knew from the start, that if we impose massive financial and economic sanctions on Russia, it will hit us. And the difference is Russia is an authoritarian/totalitarian system that can oppress differences and different opinions and the freedom of speech and reactions and demonstrations and everything we stand for. When we look at what are challenges to democracy, then we implicitly define it as Western-type democracy with human rights and separation of power and everything else you can list in your own textbook style definition of the term. But in our case, a 19% inflation rate that you can currently speculate is happening in Russia, and given what has just been said about numbers and economic research, we are all dependent on data that are not the same reliable data compared with what an OECD study would do, or the World Bank, or whatever counts as a reliable source of information. So if we use Russian data, then it's part of the fog of war, and we don't know how reliable this is. So at the moment it appears as if we hit Russia hard, but we don't know how hard, and we also don't know what the long-term implications are. What we do know is that the consequences of hitting Russia hard is a much smaller consequence back home, but a smaller consequence if you just take a random macroeconomic indicator like inflation. An 8% inflation in Germany is more serious than a 19% inflation rate in Russia, because you can oppress the consequences in Russia, in Germany you cannot. And therefore the consequences of are we doing the right thing compares what we call in German apple with pears, so the not comparable, even if it's the same indicators. Which means that what we compare is how robust is our political system and what is the nature of our political system. And a Western-type democracy is, by definition, pluralist, diverse, and open to all kinds of criticism. That is a necessary precondition, and it's part of what we do at the ICD, at academia, or in the combination of the two, that if we address questions and question, is it a good idea to do this, then normative questions need a norm, and they need data to double check whether it's not only logically a good idea to do, but also empirically is hitting them harder the best in terms of whatever indicator you use to compare. And even then, if we come to the same conclusion, like 19% inflation sounds harder than the 8 in an open society, it doesn't necessarily mean that the open society will not have much more like a political earthquake consequence, like the government will be kicked out because people will demonstrate or not willing to sit in their cold apartments if we run out of heating systems. That is something that will not happen in Russia because the Russian government and its security system can oppress this. But if the consequence would then be, and therefore we should stop doing it, it would mean that we give up. And then what we are committed to, like standing up for multilateralism and enforcing the rule of law and believing in international law, is a cornerstone of what we stand for, then this is just a lip service and you can go home and leave it up to each and every authoritarian system to decide what to do, under what conditions you break international law or you ignore the consequences or the immediate effects of what you've been doing. So even if the consequences are harsh, and it will be a tough winter, not only in Germany with all the related consequences given the supply chain management in a single market like the European single market, I still think we did the right thing to not let Russia get away without raising the price for a violation of international law. For how long this is going to last is another question. But just reacting like after Crimea, when it was more like, don't do this, this was a violation, and respect international law and the integrity of the territory of a sovereign state, or don't talk about Ukraine as if it's not a sovereign state, this will not lead to anything, and it will only be an invitation to move on if, in Putin's mindset, the collapse of the Soviet Union is the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century, which is definitely not short of catastrophes, then people in Lithuania or what other countries once belonged to the Soviet Union have all the reasons to question what the value-based Western model is about and whether you could count on international law and alliances like NATO or the solidarity clause in the European Union. So from that perspective, I don't have a crystal ball to predict what these sanctions will lead to. It can also be the opposite, that not Russia manages to handle it because it can oppress all kinds of consequences. I doubt whether the substitution strategy, that selling energy to other consumers like India, will be as easy as it appeared in your short intervention, because the problem with gas is it comes through pipelines, and pipelines have two ends. So you cannot easily build a pipeline to India overnight. There is one under construction to China, but it's only one. And what we, or maybe two.
One exists, the other one is.
But if we look at the total amount of gas that we in Europe consumed and declared long before the war that we are committed to end a fossil-based economy, then this is the end of the Western-Russian relationship, because it was built on a very unsustainable relationship that we produce massively investment goods, machinery and consumer goods that we sell to Russia, and Russia has basically not much else to offer than raw materials. And if we decide that we don't want this anymore because we can't afford on that planet to continue doing this, burning fuel like crazy, because that will ruin the living conditions of the human species on this planet, then this is the end of the Russian business model in relationship with us. If others will follow and continue burning what we decided not to burn, is a big question for the survival of the living conditions for humans on this planet, but it's not happening overnight. You can do it with oil because you ship oil, but shipping liquefied gas is also something that is not happening overnight. And when we look at the compensations for all the technology losses that Russia is facing, then according to the Chinese data, China is not stepping in and filling the gap of technological goods that Russia urgently needs. So there is certainly not the expected short-term effect of the Western sanctions, but there's definitely a mid-term effect. And that brings me back to my original task to talk about global changes, which I want to combine with another major game changer that troubles me as much as climate change, and that's technology. Because with technology, we have seen that the human species turned the globe into something completely different. And we can think back to something when we discovered that there is something like burning fuel will extend the human power that is not just muscle power, but it is machinery that massively increases our productivity to an extent that for thousands of years was completely unthinkable. And now we decide to fade out from this. This is a major step. The invention of nukes is a major step when we think of the destructive power of what we could do, how many times we can blow up the globe. And what we now face is that artificial intelligence is about to do something similar, and we embrace it because it looks like a wonderful business opportunity, and it's so handy for consumers to just follow the blue dot or do things that is just a suggestion on your Spotify account or the other convenient things. But it undermines the basic functioning of our Western-type democracies in the sense that we assume that Western-type democracies are something like a beauty contest of different political parties or politicians. So we, the informed citizens, sit down, listen to the program of the different candidates or parties, and then we decide rationally, this is in our best interest, this is good for the country, and then we have the feeling that we, the active citizens, collectively as the demos, govern the country and hand over our power as the demos to representatives in a Western-type representative democracy for a limited time. This is the ideal. But what we now see since, let's say, the Obama administration campaign using social media and even more so Cambridge Analytica is the ability of algorithms to read our preferences and how we tick. And that means that we are on the step of something what I once listened to when I was a teenager and Sting was singing a song, but perhaps the dream is dreaming us. And this is now happening in real time, that the dream is dreaming us in the sense of we think we form an opinion, but the opinion is forming us. And if this is a cornerstone of reading our big data in a way that we are not fully aware to understand, then it goes as far as questioning the core principles of Enlightenment. Because in Enlightenment, we learned to question everything, which again is in our DNA as Western-type democracies, that we question authorities, we question the line of argumentation, we question whether it's a good idea to impose sanctions on Russia, we question everything. But if we now stop knowing what the causal links between A and B is, and the blue dot is only guiding us somewhere, but we miss the part in between. What made the blue dot guide us there, and what made the blue dot suggest that I should listen to a song because of all the songs I've been listening to before, then it does the same thing with my political sensitivity and opinion. Because if I appear to be sensitive about animal rights, then I receive messages about animal rights on my preferred newsfeed that make me freak out about how terrible the world treats animals, and then I might take a political decision that I otherwise would have never taken. Or if I have the feeling that it doesn't lead to anything anyway, and I get so frustrated, then I don't participate in elections because of the world that was constructed in my newsfeed based on how I tick. And this is something I personally don't have an answer to, because on the one hand, it's happening everywhere. There are no places that are not affected by artificial intelligence, but if I ask you guys how much you are aware of it and how your personal strategy is to become analog in certain ways, or how do you double check what is reliable information and what is not, I don't think that you will have a satisfying result, but ask yourself and make a test. This is definitely something that will change societies, and we will have those who have a certain literacy, and we have others who don't, which also changes the labor market upside down. And if there's something similar to what I just said about Russia can handle a 19% inflation rate and we in Europe cannot, then it's a similar thing about the legitimacy of a Western-type democracy that is not only based on does it deliver, but it's also based on do we actively participate and do we understand in what we participate. So when we only look at what are the expectations to our governments, what people expect the governments to do, then all the threats that I just briefly mentioned go way beyond what a single country can do. Therefore, I'm fully supportive to all forms of regional integration if the ideal, like a multilateral system that acts as a responsible global system of governance, is more in decline and deconstructed by all the powers that prefer to build a multipolar world and dismantle the functioning of multilateral institutions. We are lucky in Europe that we still have something that is working, but we don't know for how long it's going to last. So on this not so happy note that there are major challenges both for our basic assumptions for democracy as well as challenges that are bigger than what we can handle as a single country or a region, I leave it up to the Q&A because I just got a warning that it's 16:07 already and I just wanted to skip my introduction and say something else instead. Thank you very much for your attention and I look forward to the discussion.
So I do have to make some comments and don't, if the old white man in charge comes up, don't feel personally insulted, because I'm going to speak up for the Global South. I was a little bit non-happy with the binary you opened up. The binary between first Western-type democracy, which one is that? Is that Hungary? Is that the US under Trump? Which one is actually, or what about Al Gore and not getting elected? So I find that particularly arrogant, and it's like some kind of Enlightenment tradition to say that Europeans have reason and are like somehow proud to democracy and all the other people are not, and democracy is the highest good ever. There's different kinds of democracies, there's different human rights, and there's even some human rights that are in conflict with democratic political freedom. So the world is much more colorful than you presented. I would oppose that. I feel like talking about joining NATO is fighting imperialism with imperialism and not looking at the solutions. And I'm also thinking it's a hypocrisy because we know what Sweden and Finland did, right? They did give political refugees to Turkey. So in order to join an institution that defends human rights, they violated political asylum rights. So we have to openly talk about that's hypocrisy. That's the same Western hypocrisy as always. So NATO is not the white knight and Russia is not pure evil, right? We are always talking about humans and we're talking about different human cultures. Yes, at this historic point, Russia invaded, okay? Evil, yes, I agree, but we cannot generalize in that way, and if we generalize in that way, we are not going to find to an understanding. Similar thing with LNG terminals. LNG terminals suck. Is it better to get oil from Qatar than from Russia? Is it better to be dependent on Saudi Arabia? Like, we have to honestly. Also this morning we didn't talk about the other side, right? We presented as if there was one good and one bad side, but a lot of times it's more like in German it's pest or cholera, the plague or cholera. There is no white knight that is going to save us. So there is no, it's better that we have close relationship to the US now. No. The content is important, right? What are the relationships bringing forward? What is it doing for the people? Yes, we are particularly well off in Europe, but who is well off? Not all people. Sinti and Roma are not. Like, there's many people also in Europe. There's also poverty in Europe. There's children that go hungry this night, even in Germany. So we have to be very careful and differentiate more. Similarly, I would differentiate more and say in the future Russia is actually well off because they have huge agricultural potential. So yes, maybe we are going to be post-gas, but we have to, because of climate change, they have actually lots of resources. So I see the world much more colorful. Similarly, with like if somebody actually observed international politics, he and Putin met 2 weeks before the war started, and they were declaring, and that really scared me. Like I wasn't like surprised at all. They declared that they have a new human rights regime, right? That they work on together we will work on a different interpretation of human rights. And that's actually when we have to listen up. And in all together, we have to be like more intellectually honest and like stop putting binary oppositions. NATO is not a white knight and Russia is not pure evil, and similarly we have to look what did Finland and Sweden do for joining NATO, and particularly I understand why lots of our students are not from Western countries. I understand why they like are really upset with this one-sided talk in all together, right? With like in German news and Western news, that it's very, very one-sided and that it doesn't give the nuances. And I wouldn't say they're victims to Russian propaganda. They just see the world with different glasses from a different angle. So yeah, I had to do my little intervention. Now anybody else can say a question or make a comment. So I'm going to start. Jafar, you talked already today, right? So I'm going to start with the far back.
Okay.
If we are recording, does he need a microphone in order to understand what has been said?
This is a recording mic, no?
But that's only for us.
Maybe I'm just going to repeat what he said.
We'll hand it over to him and get it back.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shan. I'm from ICD. It's been almost 5 months since the beginning of the Ukraine war, and we all believe and we hope that the war will not last so long. So my question for the speaker is, do you think that it's important to normalize the relation between the European countries and Russia after the Ukraine war? And if yes, so what could be the roles of the Croatia and its cultural diplomacy in terms of normalizing the relations? And if not, so why?
Let's collect a couple questions first.
Thank you. I'm Ismail from ICD. Probably question was to both of you to do the presentation today, because we have heard Russia saying we're going to invade Ukraine, and nobody probably cares until it happened. So now we are seeing China almost with Taiwan, tensions. Maybe one day it's going to happen that way, and maybe could happen somewhere else. So my question goes to you or to anyone else, is the world ready to prevent those kind of incidents that keep on happening everywhere in the world? And my second question is, of course, when there is war, the ordinary citizens are the ones to be victims, whether in a war or in the sanctions that the EU and US took against Russia. There is always problems on ordinary citizens. So what EU and the allies are doing to ensure that those citizens are protected? Thank you.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I let them answer, and then maybe we can go for a second one. No?
There was one about the role of Croatia. We have not had an independent discussion.
Yeah.
Definitely, I think that the solution needs to be tangible. We all agree upon that Ukraine needs to preserve its territorial integrity. So no chances to change the situation until there will be some tangible, concrete results being approved by Ukraine. I think that international law and international order is not a la carte. Sometimes it seems to me that we are behaving like in the restaurant, saying, okay, fine, I'll order chocolate and then some soup and that's it. This is not like it is functioning. So we have to have some new security arrangements or new security structure. What will come afterwards, it's impossible to imagine. Are we going to have some new Helsinki Act? This is so far impossible to be seen. I think that culture is playing a very important role. I did see some very important Russian people and friends as well, who are basically doing everything to send their children to study in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Here in Berlin we have 300,000 people with Russian origins. So this is quite important to see values and to be honest. There is no perfect world, there is no perfect state. But I think it's quite important to see that young people are coming to study and to work here. They are not moving direction Russia. This is quite important, and I think that on the long run, in some concrete, pragmatic way, maybe we will see some changes, but it's not very prosperous, doesn't look very rosy situation. It's very hard to predict, but we have to use all of the opportunities to persuade peace and pursue the peace and to make some progress. But again, without some tangible, concrete outcomes in Ukraine, it will not work. So we got to be patient and resistant and be very pragmatic, but also to have a wider scope, wider goal, wider picture.
I see another couple more people.
We haven't answered them.
You didn't answer the guys? Er didn't listen. Du hast die letzte
Ich habe dir 3 Fragen gegeben, er hat eine beantwortet und jetzt machen wir eine zweite Runde.
My name is
Mein Gehirn ist frittiert hier drin.
I also study at ICD, and I was wondering if we could have come to any solution, like trying to go into the table and talk and try to find dialogue, and also like go a bit back for the Russian demands, like or talks, to go back to the Budapest Pact and bring back the borders of the NATO and just like try to demilitarize the area, and also to, I don't know, like take some of the members of the pact and try to respect what was signed there, because like I know from what I have heard and read that Merkel and Sarkozy, they were like really pushed by the US during that time. I don't know if it was 2007 and something, and I wonder if that could have come into the interest of bringing more of a neutral area, or try to create like pacification zone or a buffer zone for the state of Ukraine, instead of just like giving more weapons, cutting the dialogue, and just like escalating that to more members and more members. So I don't know, like, where is this going to end? Because this is a global crisis, which is like really affecting the most vulnerable ones. And right now we can see like African countries like having like really bad problems related to the famine and the wheat concern, also in Latin America. And for the just last point, sorry for the big questions. When you talk about the enlightenment of the society and the Western society, I think it's a bit like out of the mentality to to think that just the Western world has this ability of questioning the leaders, because in the past, in Egypt, there was this mentality of all this philosophy and so on, and I think it's a bit too short, a short thought. Sorry. Narrow.
To clarify, we do have a discussion in a second, so I haven't fully let them answer both of the questions, so now I'm going to let them both answer whatever they want to answer to, and then we're going to change for having the panel. And then you can still ask all the questions because the same people will sit there.
So starting with a question from the first row, I think it was kind of a rhetorical question, if I understood this correctly. Because if you ask if the West is ready or if the world is ready, then the answer can only be no. Because what we currently see is a lack of institutional problem-solving power because of the poor performance of multilateral institutions. So I'm sorry, but the short answer is no. Regarding the very first one, can you help me a bit? Like a keyword?
Do you think that it's important to normalize the relation between European country and Russia after Ukraine?
Well, there has never been something like a military solution, like peace in the sense of you win a war and then everything is over. So the moment the weapons end killing people, you have to sit down and find an agreement, which is the moment of diplomacy to make it a lasting peace. And it was not anything like a conflict of societies or people, but sort of governmental actions and different worldviews and ideological conflicts. So of course it is important, and the first thing I did in February was to contact my Russian friends to signal them that they are not left alone, or we don't care, or now we get Russophobe or something, but we also understand how difficult it is to be in a situation like this in which you cannot say what you want or do what you want, but you are a condition taker of something that has been decided on behalf of your country. So yes, diplomacy is the only solution, but whether this is something that can instantly lead to something is based on interests. And that brings me to the question about buffer zones. From which country are you?
I'm half Portuguese, half Brazilian, but I was born in Brazil and I lived like most of my life there.
Because I was hoping that you are from something like a potential buffer zone, because then I could have asked you whether you would like the idea of...
Like when the 1964 coup d'etat in Brazil happened, it was sponsored by the US. So it wasn't like somehow like a buffer zone. No, you are not going into the side of Russia, but you are coming forcibly by the US side, because we're not going to allow you to be like under communist hands.
Okay, for the record, I didn't praise specific countries and whitewash whatever international violations of law. I stepped on her toes, and apparently I also stepped on yours. That wasn't the intention. But what I tried to get across was there is an ideal, and the ideal is multilateralism, the rule of law, the freedom of speech, human rights, the integrity of territory, like the long list of things as an ideal. And if I believe in like policing in this country to make it safe and we don't have no-go areas or something, and then you say, but there is crime, it doesn't mean that what I believe in is wrong. So what I try to do in my humble way of speaking for 20 minutes on oversized topics was to use the ideal and how it is challenged by the challenges that I mentioned. If I didn't use the time to say, and there are also violations like the invasion in Iraq, in which my foreign minister said, Mr. President, I'm not convinced, and we didn't join the coalition of the willing. There are endless examples in which the West or representatives of the West didn't do the right thing, which doesn't mean that there is no such thing like a Western-type democracy as a term that you can question whether this is something that describes it correctly. But I think everybody would say my country is a democracy, including North Korea, and it doesn't lead to it to anything if we just let everyone get away with, and I have my personal definition of democracy, because then it doesn't explain anything. So what I'm trying to do is to start, given that we are here and that I'm a professor for European Studies, with a definition of what the European Union and the German Constitution is committed to, and go from there to see what the challenges are. Coming back to the buffer zone, this is a radically different international order compared with what I think we should achieve, and that's my personal normative bias, that if we live in a country of sovereign states, everyone is sovereign and can decide what is in your best interest to reach your security goals or what is best for the people of your country. If we tell others, listen guys, you should rather serve as a buffer, and therefore we restrict your right as a sovereign state to choose the security order that you decide is in your best interest, or you join the European Union because you think it's better for your country, then we patronize them in a way that could also continue with a post-colonial discourse that I'm happy to have in this country or in this conference here. So my wish that you would come from a country in which we could exemplify this, what it would mean to the people if we restrict their limits, is kind of similar to what Ukraine believed in when they decided to get rid of all the nukes as some sort of a tit for tat. We get rid of nukes, and in return we have guaranteeing forces that guarantee the integrity and the sovereignty of the state of Ukraine. Bad luck. It didn't work out. The moment the last nuclear weapon was gone, the invasion started, and the bad luck for the country was that it didn't belong to anything, because the main quality difference between, let's say, Lithuania and Ukraine is that Lithuania belongs to something. So the threshold for using force against Lithuania to rewrite history and to restore the dignity and pride of the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century, the fall of the Soviet Union, is something that so far Putin is not willing to afford. And he rather goes for Ukraine. If the price for occupying Ukraine is prohibitively small, or is so small that it doesn't feel like he can't afford it, then why not continuing with something else? And I think that would be the fear of everyone who gets your label, you should serve as a buffer, because I'm convinced by the narrative of Russia has legitimate security concerns, which everyone would have taken seriously, sit down and find a diplomatic solution. But the moment you use military means to do whatever you think is in your best interest to find an alternative, then you stand out of an order that is based on the sovereignty of states like Ukraine. And he openly questions it. So I think that's the different perspective on you belong to something or you don't, with all the consequences. Did I miss any of the questions that have been asked?
We have more time in panel, but do you want to
On
comment?
the terminology, I think this is a slight misunderstanding. What the gentleman from Brazil conveyed was the importance of neutrality, and that is also what applies to Austria during the Cold War. Austria was a neutral territory, and we got our independence and safety, security on the basis, yes, of having committed ourselves in Moscow in the memorandum to a status of permanent neutrality. And during the time of the Cold War, it was very important that there was in the center of Europe an area, a state, not only Austria, also Switzerland, where the rival powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, did not have any military presence, where, to the contrary, they could meet, where so many of the peace initiatives took place, summit conferences between the presidents of the United States and Soviet Union, in Geneva as well as in Vienna. And we did not feel in Austria, we did not feel in 55. And when the state treaty was signed, that when Austria had said, if the state treaty is signed, we will declare permanent neutrality, consequently. But we do not feel that this was imposed on us. It was just a kind of diplomatic bargaining on the basis of the assessment of the interests of both sides, Austria on the one side and the Allied powers, including the Soviet Union, on the other. So I think one can then describe such neutral areas with as in having the effect of a kind of buffer zone. But the term, what you meant, the proper term would be neutral area.
But even if you call it neutral area and you use Sweden and Finland as an example, it was a fundamental element of their identity when Finland became an independent state 100 and something years ago, to define itself as neutral, similar to what Sweden did much longer. And now they come to the conclusion that their analysis of the security risks of the 21st century doesn't allow them to feel safe if neutrality is the only thing that protects them. So it's not like they can't wait to join an aggressive imperialist force because it's so attractive to be an imperialist, but it's their only way of feeling protected if they don't have the means as a small country with a border with 1,300 kilometers shared with Russia to find any other option for protecting their country and their interests. So I think this is the implication that it has if we rewrite an international order in terms of first-class sovereign states and those who are condition takers because we label them that you belong to the influential zone of the one or the other part of the world, which probably is what the 21st century is leaning to. I missed the talk in the morning when there was a question about regionalization. I forgot the exact term, and I wished I could have gone and listened to what the trend is, because coming back to my tech part that puzzles me, technology is seen by our different political and economic systems differently. And to generalize to an extent that is unacceptable, I could sort of generalize in the sense of tech in America is a business. Tech in China is a surveillance model. And the way the European Union presents its attitude towards technology is it should serve the people. And everyone who looks at it from this different angle comes to very different regulatory conclusions how you deal with the internet. And if we continue doing this, then the internet as we know it, as something like a global phenomenon that is basically the same from wherever you sign up with your devices in a global system, will come to an end. And then we have regional forms of technological services, but they're no longer interoperational, and we sort of build firewalls or whatever systems that doesn't allow people from China to access systems in the West and vice versa, and American corporations also have a different attitudes on that. And how that affects our ability to stay connected and to make use of technological innovations, especially in this relatively small part of the world that is also aging, and old people usually don't innovate that much, is also something that confuses me very much. But as a consequence for security and how democracy and our global ability to deal with global challenges will be affected is something that doesn't make me feel very optimistic.